Hello, so this video is going to look at what is climate justice. Now, we have heard about climate change, and some of us have also heard about climate justice in the context of climate change. Now, climate change, of course, we have seen and we have learned that the causes for climate change, which is basically greenhouse gases that includes carbon and methane and other greenhouse gases, does not come from a single country or some countries in that sense. So the historic emission of greenhouse gases that caused climate change did come from some peculiar countries disproportionately. So these historic emissions that came from some particular countries have caused massive devastation and impact of climate change in countries that did not emit these kind of emissions proportionately, which basically mean, for example, countries like United States or European Union, for example, have been emitting a huge amount of historic carbon as well as methane. Now, if we look at the same, we have countries that faced far-reaching impacts of climate change in the form of sea level rise, in the form of extreme weather events, in the form of glaciers melting. We see that these countries are not the same countries that emitted huge amount of greenhouse gases in that sense. So we see Bangladesh, we see countries who are in the low-lying regions. Actually, we see countries particularly in Africa, in South Asia and in South America in that sense, where we see countries that have caused very less or least carbon emissions are being impacted disproportionately. So the people, farmers and a whole lot of other people who are basically dependent on natural weather cycles are being increasingly being impacted by anthropogenic climate. From Our World in Data, an initiative that provides a lot of data about climate change, which shows that who has contributed most to global CO2 emissions. So what you see here in green, in red and in orange is basically data that is estimated from 1751 to 2017 data to look at historic emissions of CO2 particularly. And you see this is also based on production based emissions, which means CO2 produced domestically from fossil fuel combustion and cement do not correct for emissions embedded in trade that's consumption based. So an emission from international travel is also not included in this, of course. So you see here North America, that includes USA, Canada, Mexico, and few other countries in the North America, with a 25% of the global cumulative historic emissions, where of course you have USA with highest emissions, 25% of the global cumulative emissions. And then you see European Union that includes 28 countries with 22% of the global cumulative emissions. And you also see Russia, you also see Ukraine and Turkey, which is of course separate from the EU emissions. And then apart from North America and EU, you also see Asia, where China is an emerging or one of the biggest current emitter now, having 12% or 12.7% of the global cumulative emissions. You also see Japan, you see China, you see South Korea, you see Saudi Arabia, you see Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Iran, and some of these countries also having some of the significant or are some of the significant emitters in that sense from Asia. You see Africa, you see some countries in South America, you see Australia. So this is the significant historic representation of the historic emissions of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So you see USA and European Union in that sense is leading this, where around a total of 50% or half of the global cumulative historic emissions have come from only from EU and the US alone. So you see the kind of historic inequality that exists in uh, in carbon emissions. Now, the kind of inequality that we see here, for example, this is from the sixth assessment report of the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. You see the kind of vulnerable countries for climate change are mostly countries in Africa. You see countries in the Central and South America. You will also see in Asia, where you have countries listed, of course, as also small island countries listed and found as the most vulnerable countries, are very high vulnerability for climate change. So the vulnerability at the national level, of course, varies, and the vulnerability also, of course, greatly differs within countries. Countries with moderate or low average vulnerability have subpopulations with high vulnerability, and vice versa. So, climate justice is, of course, quite complex and complicated, where you not only have uh, inequality within countries, but also even uh, uh, within countries, where even countries that are, for example, not that much vulnerable or having a very low relative climate vulnerability, you would also see populations who are relatively more vulnerable within that. For example, if we particularly talk about racial minorities in the US, you would see them as more vulnerable population within the US that is not so much of vulnerable to climate change, according to IPCC's sixth assessment. Now, when you come to India, of course, you would see within India there are communities who are lower caste, as well as indigenous communities who are more vulnerable to climate change. Even within Africa, of course, you would also see some of these inequalities within countries as well. So there are a number of groups who are particularly vulnerable within countries, and you can see them listed here as indigenous people of the Arctic. You can see urban ethnic minorities, smallholder coffee producers, indigenous people in Amazons, older people, of course, especially those poor and socially isolated people, island communities, children in rural and low income communities, people uprooted by conflict in the Near East and Sahel. Of course, you will also see a number of other groups who are particularly vulnerable within. But when we take a larger view, when we take fundamentally the view from carbon emissions, particularly from historic emissions, in that sense, we see a significant disparity of countries that emitting or have emitted historic emissions, and then we also see a huge inequality in the ways in which how the climate change caused by those emissions are being impacted on the other end at small island, poor, and particularly in countries in Asia, Africa, and South America. Hence, we see the kind of inequality that exists at the emission side, which is the fundamental reason for global warming and climate change. And then we see the kind of countries who have been emitting carbon, methane, as well as other greenhouse gases are not the same countries who are at the receiving end of the catastrophic impacts of anthropogenic climate change. So we see poorest countries in Asia, in Africa, in South America, small island countries are being impacted by climate change in that sense. So hence, anything that we do for climate change mitigation and adaptation has to also be taking this question of climate justice into consideration, that the people and the countries or the blocks of countries who have historically emitted greenhouse gases are not the same countries who are experiencing the catastrophic impacts of climate change around the world. Hence, any action that we do, be it adaptation, be it mitigation of climate change, that has to consider and take climate justice into the center of that. That will only be then helpful for an equitable uh, climate change policies in adaptation and mitigation. Hence, let climate justice be central to or climate action and climate policies and anything that we do related to climate change in adaptation and mitigation. Thank you.